Hey, kids, more fun than a circus. The new Mattel musical toys. Here's Maddie Mattel and the Mattel Jack in the Music Box. Turn the crank, play a tune, and surprise! Up pops the Jack.
It gives a big lift when wrapped as a gift, a very likable toy. It's falling in place, brings smiles to your face, something kids can enjoy. It's slinky, for fun it's a wonderful toy. It's slinky, it's fun for a girl and a boy.
G.I. Joe, fighting man from head to toe, on the land, on the sea, in the air.
G.I. Joe attack! Boom, boom!
Today we're at the Minnesota History Center in downtown St. Paul, and we're in a brand new exhibit opened in May of 2014 called Toys of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Toys is something that everyone can relate to as a child, and so we wanted to talk about the sheer joy of being a child, being a baby boomer, but also get people thinking about how toys reflect the times in which they're made and in which they're marketed as well. We chose toys that were popular for the period. We chose some that are not so well known. We also chose toys that were popular nationally, but actually have their origins here in Minnesota. So for example, Cootie, which was a very well-known toy of the 1950s, had its start in Minneapolis in 1950 when it was marketed at Dayton's department store and was developed by Herb Schopper. Tonka Toys, which is well known throughout the world for their durability, got its start in Mound, Minnesota in the late 1940s. Twister, very well-known party game, which came out in 1966, got its start in Minnesota. Two men, Charles Foley and Neil Ravens, patented the game. The game initially wasn't that popular. In fact, some department stores refused to carry it. Sears Roebuck would not carry this game. You have to remember, this is the early 1960s, so it wasn't quite the thing for men and women to be in close contact with one another. So this was really breaking the rules. On May 3rd, 1966, Johnny Carson and Ava Gabor played the game on The Tonight Show, and sales took off. And so that is a very well-known game now that got its start in Minnesota. We've got 3 living room settings, one from the 50s, one from the 60s, one from the 70s. And within each living room setting, you'll see the toys displayed in various sub-themes. We have television sets running in each of the 3 settings where you can see commercials and TV shows from the period, see how important television was to the marketing of toys from those 3 decades.
Trouble bubbles, loads of fun.
Well, in the 1950s and post-war America, birth rates are skyrocketing, incomes are up, consumer spending is up. So more kids mean more toys. So this is really when the toy industry goes into high gear. And there are 2 things that really help that along. One is, first and foremost, television. Television is an opportunity for these toy manufacturers to market directly to children. And probably the most successful manufacturer to do that is Mattel. In 1955, they signed a 1-year contract with the Mickey Mouse Club to advertise on television, and it is extremely successful.
I'm a guitar and I have strings. I like to play while someone sings. Hi, gang. Do you recognize this mouse guitar? It's just like the one the Mouseketeers gave me.
The second thing is the introduction of plastics, which was being used for military use initially during World War II, in part because wood and metal, the materials that toys are traditionally made out of, were in short supply. So now, after World War II, plastics are being used to make toys. It's much cheaper to make them. They're durable. Kids can't break them as easily as a wood toy. So plastics become very, very important to the marketing of toys in the 1950s. The toy manufacturers had 2 visions of the future in the 1950s. One that was rather realistic, based on true science. So they were marketing chemistry sets, construction kits, the Erector set, which actually came out much earlier than the 1950s, was introduced in 1913, really reached its heyday in the 1950s. The other end of the spectrum is the future in terms of popular culture, in movies, in television, in science fiction, pulp literature, and that's where you begin to see robots, ray guns, all of those kinds of manifestations of the future in a very fictional fashion, and those were equally popular as well. So there are really two ends of the spectrum working in concert with each other. Probably the most important factor contributing to the development of scientific toys is the launch of the Soviet satellite Sputnik in 1957. This was really a wake-up call for America. We realized that we could be behind the Russians in terms of science and technology. So there are a slew of educational toys that start to come out in the late 1950s. Probably the best example, for which we have an example in the toys exhibit, is the Alpha 1 ballistic missile, which came out in 1958, which actually was designed by rocket scientists and tested at Cape Canaveral. So this was an opportunity for kids to get a really serious dose of science and technology.
When I grow up, I want to be a mommy.
You can play mommy right now with Ideal's Betsy Wetsy.
So the 1950s is really the golden age of dolls. But most of these dolls, if not all of them, are primarily white dolls. So African American children, children of other races, were more or less relegated to playing with white dolls. The major contribution to changing that conception of race in dolls comes in 1951 when Sara Lee is introduced. She's the brainchild of Sara Lee Creech, a Florida businesswoman who really felt it was important for children of all races to have a more realistic image of African Americans. She worked with a sculptor named Sheila Burlingame to work up a doll that was based on actual African American models. The doll came out in 1951, was actually very popular initially, was very short-lived, was only in production for about 2 years, in part because of the inferior materials that it was made out of. The vinyl that it was created from tended to fade and break. But still, it really was an important step in developing a more even playing ground for race in terms of how African American children were portrayed in toy industry. So now we're in the 1960s section. The 1960s is a time of great change in America, with war and revolution and assassination, the blurring of gender roles, and a lot of that was reflected in the toys of the period. Probably one of the best examples is Barbie. Barbie actually is introduced in 1959 by Mattel, but she really does become a symbol of the 60s in that she's a role model for young women. Initially, the folks at Mattel were not interested in Barbie. They didn't think the idea of a doll that had an adult image was going to be popular with kids. The real inspiration for Barbie was actually Ruth Handler's daughter, Barbara, Barbie's namesake. One day she saw Barbara playing with paper dolls and giving them adult roles, and realized there was a niche to be had here. And came out in 1959, was very popular. They sold 350,000 dolls in the first year. And what really made Barbie, I think, successful was the ability to accessorize. You bought the doll, but there was a plethora of outfits, cars, Barbie's dream house that you could buy. So it was a way of capturing the imagination of the child and keeping them interested in the character. That was also, of course, one of the criticisms of Barbie, was that she was materialistic and that she had very unrealistic proportions, and that this was detrimental to young women, that it set very unrealistic goals. But on the other side was this idea that you could be anything that you wanted to be, and Barbie was a great example of that.
When you get G.I. Joe and the authentic G.I. Joe equipment, you'll have the greatest realism, the greatest fun you ever had in playing soldier.
Well, we couldn't have a toys exhibit. We certainly couldn't have a 1960s section without G.I. Joe. Introduced in 1964, he's 50 years old this year. Was the brainchild of Don Levine, the vice president of marketing at Hasbro. It came out in 1964, the very first action figure. He was very adamant with his associates that it not be called a doll, because it would never sell with boys if it was called a doll. Was very popular when G.I. Joe first came out. Again, like Barbie, part of its popularity came from the fact that you could accessorize. There were up to 75 different accessories that you could buy for G.I. Joe. Uniforms, weapons, equipment, vehicles, all very realistic. So the doll was very, very popular. Unfortunately, as the Vietnam War went on throughout the 1960s, America became very weary of military culture, and the popularity of G.I. Joe also declined. So towards the end of the 1960s, they put G.I. Joe on furlough briefly and reinvented him in the 1970s as an adventurer. He was no longer a military figure. He was now fighting criminals, having all sorts of adventures. So he really transformed himself into a different type of character. And so it's very interesting to track his tale from 1964 to about 1970 and see how his popularity wanes with the Vietnam War. So now we're in the 1970s section. 1970s in America is a time of great disillusionment. We have an economic recession. The oil embargo is causing the gas prices to go sky high. You're starting to see more single-parent families. Kids are spending more time in daycare. So kids are starting to spend more time playing with their peers, and the toys are really reflective of that. So, for example, you see a lot more group-type games during that time. Kids are still pretty much immersed in fantasy-type games. Probably the greatest tonic of all that comes out in the 1970s, mid-1970s, of course, is Star Wars. Nobody expected this movie to be as successful as it was. Even the film studio, 20th Century Fox, gave the merchandising rights to the film to George Lucas, not realizing how important that film was going to be. The merchandising of the figures originally was going to go to Mego Corporation. They passed on it, and Kenner picked it up. And when the film opened in May of 1977, it was such a success that Kenner could not produce the toys fast enough. So by the time of Christmas 1977, they were actually giving kids what were called early bird certificates, basically a rain check for a series of 4 figures, which they could then redeem in early 1978. So probably one of the best examples and one of the first examples of how a film was successfully merchandised. The Star Wars figures that came out in 1977-78 were a new format. They were 3 3/4 inches tall. G.I. Joe was almost a foot tall. And that was relatively typical for a lot of action figures from the 60s and early 70s. The reason, or one of the reasons, that the G.I. Joe or the Star Wars figures were smaller was because of the oil embargo of the 1970s. Compelled manufacturers to make plastic toys in smaller, not only smaller quantities, but literally be smaller. The 3 3/4 inch figures actually became so popular that when G.I. Joe was resurrected as an action figure in the 1980s, it came out in that format, in a 3 3/4 inch format. So the Star Wars figures really started a new trend in action figures. One of the most important innovations in the 1970s in toys was the development of computer technology. So you start to see microchips in toys. Simon, which comes out in 1978, is a great example. Texas Instruments comes out with Speak and Spell and Little Professor in the 1970s, using digital technology. These may seem archaic to kids today, but this was really the forerunner of computer technology that we use in games today. I think between the 1950s through the 1970s, the basic tenets of play didn't change all that much. The most important thing was to give children an opportunity to harness their imagination. Whether this is a toy that was meant for educational purposes or for pure pleasure. I think that was really the primary intent. What's interesting to see is how many toys influenced the occupations of children when they became adults. So for example, a lot of the kids that played with erector sets as kids became engineers and scientists. So it's a great way to show how the toys that we play with as children really become a part of our lives and can influence who we are as adults. We have anywhere from about 500 to 1,000 people that are going through the exhibit on a weekend. So it's been an extremely popular exhibit for us. I think one of the reasons is that everybody remembers what it's like to be a kid. Everybody remembers what it's like to have that toy that you absolutely loved. And then there's, of course, the opportunity to actually throw a Nerf ball, to have a slinky go down the stairs, to play with a hula hoop, to play with Barrel of Monkeys. So it's a great opportunity for people not only to learn, but to play.